military technology is at least 20 years ahead of what's commercially made available to the general public. So when we talk about the things that I was just going over in terms of the program that was happening between 2004 and 2008, dealing with the programmable artificial cell evolution, again, that was 2004. And I can pretty much guarantee most of y'all had no idea of that taking place back then. But yet,
Evolving barbaric hieroglyphs, I spit my gifts, shift your surface with vernacular skill. The rawest live, touching down like meteors, none other than black gods. Stones in my timepiece coming from black stars. Negativity for keep far away from doors. Single-mindedly destroying the ops and the odds. Just another warrior's quest. The past may get rest. Demons coming for my crown, get beheaded like the next. These blessings never threats, just to verbalize a message, catching energies of critics. All the Atari get deaded. Pray I stay alert on the field, be skillmatic in anything my enemies steal. Be dead actions, I proceed just life I lead. Beneath it, so many seas to win. It's our time to align stars, so spirits lead. Who could war with me? Catastrophically or audibly, given no choice by God's law. I'm Lucifer on streets.
all right, power to people, everyone. All right, can just anybody to speak, let me know y'all can see what I got on the screen here.
Yeah, we can see it. All power to the people, bro.
All power to people. All right. So in continuing with basically recognition of Black August, we wanted to kind of switch it up a little bit and not necessarily just talk about the aspects of you know, what signifies Black August and how it got started, or the tradition in regards to its recognition. But what we want to talk about is the counterinsurgency aspect of it, and make sure that we're able to dive into, you know, the different concepts that are used that are weaponized against our people, so that we realize the struggle that was taking place, you know, during the 60s, 70s, you know, even before then, obviously, as well as the fight that we continue to today and the form that fight takes on. So in addressing that, one of the things that we find a lot that people talk about is systematic approaches in terms of oppression, but not enough emphasis is placed on that same concept of what we talk about systemic or systematic approaches in terms of our liberation struggle. So our ability to fight oppression must reflect a system approach, which means the methods in which we move into action must be arranged in a comprising an ordered system, which is what we find ourselves not doing too well. One of the things that we say within the Black Panther Party, in the Panther Party, is that we must define, develop, and defend. The reason why we emphasized those 3 Ds, which we talk about within our local objectives, is those help address, at least on a critical thinking level, what it means to go about something with a systematic approach. Because when you get into defining who you are and how you're going to move, and then you develop that, and then you defend that, and then you revisit that, it at least allows a basic outline in terms of a day-to-day live by concept that you can utilize. And we refer to that as a trifecta. So within this trifecta cycle, must have constant redeployment in order to apply the next generation or vision turned manifestation. That's the key aspect there, the vision turned manifestation, to enrich foundational resources from previous learned lessons. This brings us to the use of systemic foundation. So what we mean by that is, when we talk about define, develop, and defend, the idea here is, as you define and develop yourself and then defend the cause and defend what you have defined and developed, that defense aspect is reintroduced back into the definition, because everything has to be constantly recognizing that evolution is taking place in terms of just self-corrective means. And so as we deal with that, that's what we mean when we say that a constant redeployment must be taking place. And in addressing that, going into systemic foundation, our ability to maintain our advance to sustainable victories must involve systemic design in order to have generational advancement and affect the body as a whole through progression and sustainability. Now, when we talk about our movement to fight liberation, fight oppression, and address imperialism, these concepts of system and systemic approaches and foundation is what is constantly being used against the masses of people as it applies to keeping us divided as a people. So it's only natural that we recognize the same methods that are that work, practiced, tried and proven, take place within our movement. So our constant state of fighting a reactionary war has crippled our nature/natural approach to critical organization, which goes into what I referenced when I said critical thinking. So when we talk about critical thinking on a collective level, it goes into critical organization or organizing. The destabilization of a function is in constant use by design by our oppressors. The operating methods of oppression has within its embedded structure systematic and systemic currents. For more information, study the manual Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars. And the reason why I bring that up, and I do leave a reference link to a lot of different things that you can check out on the internet at the end of this document. And let me start off with that by saying, if anybody wants a copy of this document, just leave your email address in the chat box, and later on when I get an opportunity, I go back and send the document to everyone. But when we talk about being stuck in a state of flux as it applies to fighting reactionary war, what's important to recognize with that is that as long as we continue to fight from a reactionary position, it prevents us from being able to move forward and recognize the need to be visionary in terms of our approach, which also inhibits the ability to have next generational advancement, which is why we say vision turned manifestation. So addressing systemic and systematic approaches to our fighting struggle is key to moving forward. And so when we recognize and talk about Black August and talk about the significance of what it means and what it means to be a freedom fighter on whatever level you're operating from, we have to be able to take a step back and not be emotional in regards to our involvement, and recognize that we have to have systems in place. We have to have methodologies that are able to allow us to advance in our movement forward. And if for those of y'all not familiar with this manual, Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars, what's real powerful about that is that it gets into that essence of design, and it talks about utilizing and it brings you to a deep understanding actually of physics as it applies to utilizing electricity and water as concepts of current. Within the Panther Party, we also introduce that same concept when we get into strategy and tactics by adding the missing element that most people are not aware of, which has to do with the conduction, which lies between strategy and tactics. So when you talk about a concept of conduction, it is the energy pattern that flows between the two that allows, like for instance, the body, the neural nets to make its connection. And the importance of that, of just making that reference of neural nets, is going to be something we talk about later on when we get into information technology and deep mind, that we're going to talk a little bit about later here. So the next thing to obviously address here when we talk about Black August is the counterintelligence program. And for most of us are very much aware of this, but we still have to give a little bit of an overview in case those that are not familiar with this are on the line. And again, this is a public forum here. So when you talk about the counterintelligence program, the weapons of the counterintelligence had to do with psychological warfare, infiltration, harassment, illegal force, and undermining public opinion, to name a few. And so now when we deal with this and we talk about psychological warfare, The FBI and police departments used countless dirty tricks to undermine movements. They planted false media stories, published bogus leaflets and or publications in the name of targeted groups. They forged correspondence, anonymous letters, and made anonymous phone calls. They set up the Cyto movement groups run by government agents, spread misinformation about meetings and events, and manipulated our strong or armed employers, landlords, school officials, political officials, relatives, and others to inflict burdens on those working to empower the people. And these same tactics, even though, don't get caught up on the fact that we're talking about a specific program that was called the Counterintelligence Program, because in essence, anything that we go into from that matter is dealing with a psychological warfare. This here is continued to this day to be a very effective way to disarm the people. Which brings me back to something I meant to address here. So now with a lot of the things that are going on, we're dealing with what we call the tipping point. And the power has always been in the hands of the people, always. The problem is our people are so divided by a culture of individualism. This is one of the key concepts here in terms of weaponization, a culture of individualism through the Sankofa of remembering, which a lot of people from that standpoint, you need to understand the origin of the word remember, which actually, if you go back to ancient Kemet, it had to do with the reconnection of the body of Osiris in terms of how he was brought about or cut up and chopped up in multiple pieces. And so the science that went into what was referred to as remembering. Now, from the standpoint of remembering, we must be able to deal with what we call synchronized direct action consciousness. I know it's a long jargon, but let me say that again, synchronized direct action consciousness. And when we do that, then we can return to the concept of what we call encounter intelligence program to the masses. So make sure y'all peep that, the encounter intelligence program. And so what that lies and goes into is basically addressing the fact that we have knowledge and the way we operate as a collective body has been utilized against us. So therefore, knowing that, the counterintelligence program was enacted just on the standpoint of addressing the dynamic and physics of how a collective body or group of people operate. So when you talk about the demise of a population, that's when you go into the ideas of the counterintelligence, which again, through psychological operations and warfare, concept number one, it is very effective against a population of people or an individual. This goes into certain things that we're not necessarily going to talk about within this discussion that are real big and mainstream today, especially through media, in terms of what you call neurolinguistic programming and just how to manipulate and trick a society or population into a state of consumption. Now, the second thing you talk about when you deal with the counterintelligence program is the infiltration. Agents and informants not only spied on political activists, but their main purpose was to discredit, disrupt, and negatively redirect action. Their very presence served to undermine the trust and scare all potential supporters. The FBI and police exploited this fear to smear genuine actors as agents. They use badge jacketing to create suspicion about targeted activists, causing members to attack and sometimes kill each other, and generated distrust and aided in the breaking apart of leadership and coalitions. And this goes right back into what we was talking about when we went into the idea here of talking about synchronized direct action consciousness, because when you go into a situation where you create distrust and you create a process to be able to dismantle the collective body and the collective operation of anything, then it causes itself to be able to go into autopilot mode. And then again, it also causes us to operate from a reactionary position. So we have to be able to step back. Those of us that are heavily involved in this struggle have to be able to step back and see these different methodologies being utilized regardless of a name. And that's one of the biggest things that we go into when we talk about being able to define a movement or define any position from whether it be a strategist or a tactical point of view, is that you have to be able to see it for what it is. Oftentimes, through the recoding of definitions, the enemy is able to trick you into thinking one way based upon a word structure, which causes you, again, to have a pattern of perception that may take you away from the true essence of how you need to think and operate, which goes into a direct pattern of what we refer to as linear thinking as well. And so we have to be able to break these weapons and these chains of things that have been used against us. Number three, in dealing with counterintelligence program, has to do with harassment via the legal system, which is obvious. We constantly deal with this, even way beyond just the COINTELPRO level. So the FBI and police use the legal system to harass and harass people, and then make them appear as criminals. The officers in law gave perjured testimony and presented fabricated evidence as a pretext for false arrest and wrongful imprisonment. They discriminatorily enforce tax laws, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that at the end. We're going to close this actually up. We're talking about the importance of drawing a connection and pattern between that. So the discriminatory enforce tax laws and other government regulations, and use conspicuous surveillance, investigative interviews, and grand jury subpoenas in an effort to intimidate activists and silence their supporters. So just keep that in mind, especially when we talk about this in terms of how we're going to roll all this up actually in with this one here on tax laws. The legal force. The FBI conspired with local police departments to threaten dissents, to conduct illegal break-ins in order to search dissents' homes, and to commit vandalism, assaults, beatings, and assassinations. The objective was to frighten or eliminate and disrupt the movements of our people. And then the fifth one here was to undermine public opinion. One of the effective ways the FBI targeted organizations was by challenging their reputations in the community and denying them a platform to gain legitimacy. J. Edgar Hoover specifically designed programs to block leaders from spreading their philosophy publicly or through communications media. Furthermore, the organization created and controlled negative media meant to undermine Black Power organizations. For instance, they oversaw the creation of documentaries skillfully edited to paint the Black Panther Party as an aggressive and false newspapers that spreaded misinformation about party members. And now, with us being in the age of information and the way social media works, this aspect in terms of undermining public opinion is very much ingrained and crystallized within a means to control the masses. In fact, it has taken a different type of turn here, especially within the United States, to where you're actually dealing with what's called information overload. And with information overload, you have a sense of a few aspects of real or factual information embedded within a whole lot of conspiracy, lies, and controversy and drama in order to draw people in. And by you having one thing that you can attach a element of truth to, you start buying into the entire story. And from that standpoint, when so much information is being out there and being inundated with the people, it creates this barrage of just a battlefield of information that overloads you, and to the point to where you're not able to have enough time to even get down to the bottom of the truth. And it'll have you chasing your tail, especially as it applies to being involved and being active in the community. You'll find yourself just being way inundated with a lot of things that just is irrelevant, and also being exposed to specific incidents that don't actually provide you tools of engagement in terms of fighting oppression, but more or less simply give you data and experience as it applies to, hey, this is what they want you to see, this is how they want you to act, and these are the things and images that they want you to gravitate and go and pull into, which also leads into how we have created so much of a actual culture around mediocre forms of protest. Now, mind you, protest in itself has been watered down here recently with a lot of the younger movements, simply because of the way information has not been transpired properly, as a result of the attacks that are placed upon us. This goes right back to feeding into when we talk about define, develop, and defend. And when we're not able to set a proper foundation, what happens is younger generations or younger people that decide they want to be a part of something greater and help fight for the cause don't have much to stand on. And so they find themselves reinventing the wheel and having to relearn some of the same lessons that we've already dealt with, which is why we talk about lessons learned here. So the idea here is to have an enriched foundation of resources from previous lessons learned. And again, the issue with that is by us not being in control of the media and us not being in control of a lot of the outlets that we deal with, we're not able to address what's going on and how that information can feed into the public, into the masses. Anybody got any questions or comments before I move on? We got a pretty good sized class here. All right, I keep moving. The next page here, I'm not going to talk much about. What I wanted to do is at least include this in the document for the sake of representation in terms of COINTELPRO. And it's just a tiny list of a few people, just from a historical standpoint, that have been victims of COINTELPRO, which, in itself can be hours and hours of study, if not longer, just talking about each individual one of these cases and how did they wind up being entrapped through COINTELPRO. But in saying that, just know that when we talk about the aspects that we talk, the 5 concepts of weapons used in COINTELPRO here, is that all of this is still in use to this day. So disregard the name of the actual name when we talk about the counterintelligence programs of the 1960s and 70s, because only thing that has really changed is the name of the program. And the methodologies have just increased and they're able to be deployed on a different front. But for the most part, all of this is just more so enhanced and continues to get enhanced with each generation, especially as long as we're not able to recognize what it means to have synchronized direct action consciousness. So if there's one thing I definitely want y'all to pull away from the main meat of the discussion, is that concept that most of y'all probably have not heard, synchronized direct action consciousness, because that goes into some of the that goes into countering some of the programs we're going to talk about here. So let me go into that next. MK Ultra. So that terminology that I used, synchronized direct action consciousness, is pulled directly from some of the discoveries that was gained in terms of weaponization used against our people through Project MK Ultra, which MK Ultra was a human experimentation program designed and undertaken by the United States Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. The experiments were intended to develop procedures and identify methods that could be used for brainwashing and psychological torture. MK Ultra used numerous methods to manipulate the subject's mental state and brain functions, such as covert administration of high doses of psychoactive drugs, especially LSD, and other chemicals, electric shock, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, isolation, and verbal sexual abuse, in addition to other forms of torture. Now, what's very important about MK Ultra, and I really can't emphasize enough about this program. For one, ran by the CIA. Number two, there was so many private agencies that were involved, and each one of them basically operated through grants and other forms of money to do different types of experiments on humans, and especially as it applied to how the mind operates, how the brain operates, and how everything connects in terms of what we think is the real world, how you form your perception and your reality, and how you act upon it. As a result of that, that led into Project Bluebird and Project Artichoke, amongst many others. But in specifically, when we talk about Project Artichoke, it officially rose on August the 20th. So that's another point, that the reason why I wanted to bring this up in Black August in 1951, and was operated by the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence. See, that's another thing here too. A key jewel here of some of the things we discussing is the names of these programs and what these programs mean. So here you go, a program operated by the Scientific Intelligence Department of CIA. Most people are not even familiar with the fact that there's a Office of Scientific Intelligence, yet alone any other aspect of the CIA. But the primary goal of Project Artichoke was to determine whether a person could be involuntarily made to perform an act of attempted assassination through LSD, hypnosis, and total isolation. The main tools of the experiment were conducted. Project Artichoke was a mind control program that gathered information together with the intelligence division of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and the FBI. And let me say that again. They gathered information along with the intelligence divisions of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and FBI. So this was, in essence, a military project. Think of it like that. In addition, the scope of the project was to gain control of individuals to the point of where the subject's will to do bidding against their will and even against fundamental laws of nature, such as self-preservation. So the point being is that the experimentation was so powerful in terms of what they discovered that it would cause you to operate against your basis logic, against your basis perception. And by doing so, one of the things that has to be brought to the attention of us is that a lot of the things in terms of the processing, where things could be turned on and off at a specific time. There is a movie out, and most of y'all may be just familiar with this, called The Manchurian Candidate. And that actually goes into certain aspects of what was learned through Project MK Ultra and Project Artichoke. And in fact, it can, you know, without having the physical evidence before me, you can best believe that some of the mass shootings and some of the quote unquote random acts of individual destruction that take place is a result of some of this stuff here that has been taken on, or experiments. You know, not to be sounding conspiratorial, but the bottom line is these are real experiments that took place, and real type of experiments that continue to this day, just under different names. So we have to be aware of this, and going into these things is what helps us to understand just how to form a basis of defense against certain types of things. Because when we talk about, again, dealing with synchronization of direct action consciousness, it brings us back around to finding out what it is that we lost. In studying our history, most of us are obviously aware of the fact that we're operating without an intact culture. We're operating without intact language. We're operating without an intact reference point in terms of where we come from as a people. But when you talk about the effects of weaponizing the masses of people, that goes beyond just racial makeups, and go into the fact that what we're dealing with now is how to make a person a sheeple, how to, again, deal with the collective operation of how people think across the board and interject the monkey mind. And that can be turned on and off at will. So later on here, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the scientific aspects of that. Now, what's important about these particular projects is they actually lead into something else that was going on from August 18th through the 20th in 1996. In San Jose Mercury News, articles were published that went into the exposure of the war on drugs in terms of how it was brought against brought against the masses of the people, specifically launched in LA through the Bloods and the Crips. So for the better part of a decade, cocaine was supplied to the Bloods and Crips gangs in Los Angeles and funneled millions of drug profits to the Latin American guerrilla army run by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. So again, we talk about the CIA being involved in the program to attack the general population. This drug ring opened up the first pipeline between Colombia's cocaine cartels and the black neighborhoods of Los Angeles. And as a result, cocaine that flooded in helped spark a crack explosion in urban America. U.S. Representative from California's 43rd Congressional District since 1991, Maxine Waters, fought hard to bring to light this war that was being fought to destroy our communities. And I made a note here that she was born August the 15th. Just another emphasis on Black August. So the thing about the war on drugs, without really getting heavy into it, if from those of y'all that are old enough to remember, Ronald Reagan was heavily pumping and pushing this throughout the media and creating legislation to basically lock up so many of our people behind this. So when they promoted the idea of the war on drugs in terms of public opinion, it was supposed to be the answer to actually solve a lot of the problems in terms of just drugs being infested in our communities. Little did most people know at the time is that basically what you're dealing with is the status quo trick of to where oppressive forces would create a problem in order to bring about a solution. An example of that, basically, in using this as an example, before the public is aware of it, drugs are infested in the community. And then comes along this legislation that basically say, hey, we're going to put a stop to all of these problems that are going on, and we have a solution that we're going to present and provide to the people, and obviously get politicians and the body of people all on board, thinking that it is one thing, not recognizing all along that the solution was developed before the problem so that the solution can be interjected into the people. And every time these types of things are done within the political process, it goes into the removal of our actual human rights in exchange for civil liberties. And so what happens to us collectively over time as we become more and more of a slave to a system that is basically designed to continue to keep us divided as a people. And the same thing goes into the current status when we talked about the culture of individualism. The culture of individualism hops into and goes into trying to exploit all of the different variances that a person can try to embrace in terms of not being a part of a proper collective struggle. And so currently today we deal with this concept, which is why you people are so caught up in the abortion rights legislation, as well as a lot of the LGBT concepts and things that have been going on. All of these things lead to individual choices that are being pushed on the people that supersede anything that has to do with collective operation and collective recognition and understanding and consciousness. So understand that there's a master plan that goes into all of the design behind this stuff. And so the war on drugs, the CIA war on drugs, was just another element within the attack against the people. Now, another one that leads into that took place before that actually was, hold on a second here, was a Racketeer Influence and Corruption Organization Act, which is called the RICO law. And the thing about the RICO law, as it provided for extended criminal penalties and civil causes of action for acts performed as part of an ongoing criminal organization. RICO was enacted by Section 901A of the Organized Crime Control Act of 1970, enacted in October 15, 1970. Under the RICO, a person who has committed at least 2 acts of racketeering activity drawn from a list of 35 crimes, 27 of which would be federal and 8 of them state crimes, within a 10-year period. And that's the banger right there. Within a 10-year period can be charged with racketeering if such acts are related in one of 4 specific ways to an enterprise. Those found guilty of racketeering can be sentenced from 20 years in prison per racketeering account. And so a lot of times what this goes into is showing you how cases can be made for 10 years or more before they actually bust somebody. So the thing about it is you may have a person involved in something that has no idea that they're setting themselves up to be hit under the RICO law. So examples of that would be the Cowboy Mafia, which is a group from Texas, Tennessee, and Florida during the 1977-1988, imported over 106 tons of marijuana using shrimp boats. Basically, the group made, trips back and forth from Colombia to Texas. A lot of y'all may be familiar with the Hells Angels motorcycle club. That was a big thing back in the early 70s. In 1979, the United States federal government went after members of the Associates Hells Angels using the RICO law. The Latin Kings, a lot of y'all should be familiar with that organization or street tribe. Several members of the Latin Kings have been convicted of RICO offenses. Now, this is where we get into something that most of the young people are familiar with. In December 2014, rapper Bobby Smyrna and 13 GS9 members were arrested and charged with conspiracy to violate the RICO Act. A crew faced 101 charges, including narcotic sales, murder, assault, and weapons possession. Next one here. This is a person that everybody know, probably know whether they like him or not. I myself being one that don't. Tekashi 6ix9ine in 2019 was charged in the RICO case for his affiliation and associated with the Trey 9 gangster Bloods. Now, most recent here that a lot of people are familiar with, 2021, rapper YFN Lucy and 11 other associates were charged on the RICO case, which led to May the 9th, 2022, Young Thug and Gunna and 28 people were arrested in the RICO charges. And see, one thing to take note about the whole deal with the RICO law is that the RICO laws were used and start to be used against a lot of high profile hip hop artists in the community. And oftentimes, and these are just a few that we talked about here, those 4 different ones, would it be Bobby, Tekashi 6ix9ine, Lucy, and Young Thug and Gunna. The thing about them is those are just some high profile ones, but also T.I. got basically bought up in some of the same stuff in regards to some weapons he had, and almost seeing himself facing the same thing. Another example of where they was attempting to try to do this with had to do with Professor Griff. They wanted to come out to Professor Griff under these same things. In fact, he emphasized in a couple of books he wrote dealing with the hip hop industry, just how detrimental it is and how you need to be careful about, having yourself wound up being attacked in the RICO laws used against you. And what's important for us to take away from the RICO laws in these current times is that you may have, just say we as talking about the organization of the Black Panther Party, there may be somebody who could potentially be an FBI implant or provocateur, which we didn't really get much into, but an agent provocateur that ends up killing somebody, and another provocateur that ends up selling drugs to call themselves funneling money into the organization, all of which are on government payrolls. But based upon that not being obvious knowledge to the masses of the community, now the organization can find itself falling under the guise of RICO of the RICO laws, and high profile members of the organizations can be wrapped up under the RICO laws based upon actions of a few other people. And so the whole thing with the RICO laws is it gives legal justification for basically neck grabbing across the board. But I do go ahead and you have something to add to this?
Yeah, it was just a real quick point on MK Ultra and your reference to the Manchurian Candidate. A big thing to remember for everybody in that notion is when we think of those things, we think of, you know, these big laboratories and, you know, all these tests. And that's what they did years ago. Today, they've perfected it. And all it comes down to is grooming and triggers. Somebody could be on social media right now seeing specific words and watching specific videos. And that is the grooming process of the system to turn them into an operative. And then with just a single word, a phrase, or a video, it can activate them to say, okay, now it's my time. And it's not, you know, a flip of the brain saying, okay, now I'm an agent. It's just saying, you know, now I am emboldened to go and do this. So it's something to keep in mind. It sounds a lot less conspiracy theory when you start to break down how small of a push from them can have a massive impact on a mind that isn't expecting it.
Thank you for that. And I go to you next, Bunchy. One thing I want to add to that is this is why it is super important for those people that decide that they want to be a part of a movement to help liberate and free the minds of our people and fight for collective consciousness, is that you are a student of psychology. We have to all be students of psychology so that we can recognize these type of entrapments and these type of weapons and be able to portray that and release that information to the public and to the people. Go ahead, Brother Bunchy.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's interesting that we discussing this, and then you brought up all of the members of the hip hop community who are, you know, falling victim to the RICO charges. And this is going to lean both to what Addo was just talking about and what you were talking about on a previous PE call that we were on. Music, entertainment, in and of itself, is hypnotic. And if you don't believe me, ask yourself how many times you caught yourself singing a song that you heard 100 times on the radio, but you know you don't like. You can't stand it. But for whatever reason, something tips you, and now you're singing the song. Or maybe you hear somebody say a word that's in the hook of the song, and now you're singing the hook of that record. It's all about programming. That's why people who run radio stations are called program directors.
Yep.
It's not an accident that you hear the same song 30 times a day. That's by design, because what they do is they utilize that same degree of mind control. Now mind you, the radio is not as expansive or as intrusive as MK Ultra, but it could be if you allow it to be. So all of the things that we watch, that we listen to, all of those things have an inherent effect on your mind if you're not prepared for what it is that you're going to be ingesting into your psyche. So just be prepared. And it's a reason why all of these rappers are falling victim to these RICO charges. There's a reason why that's happening. If you watch, there's a video on YouTube that is talking about a meeting that was held in 1991 about using hip hop and the music industry to funnel young Black men and women to the prison industry. So I mean, it's right in front of your face, yo. I don't even have to go no further than that. But yeah, I just wanted to add that on because, especially since you were talking about all the musicians.
Thank you, brother. Doc, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick thought I had listening to a bunch of talk was also the role that you see, U.S. State Department funded, hip hop studios used to stir up counter-revolutionary efforts in Cuba. That's a huge thing they do. And I just thought about that.
And one thing, going back into what Brother Bunchy talked about is the influence we talk about within music and how that is hypnotic. Again, when we talk about these programs, one of the key elements throughout the programs had to do with hypnotism. And too often, most people, when they think of hypnotism, they think of somebody waving something in front of your eyes, the TV cliche, and saying these specific words and clapping their hands and snapping their fingers, and then you're hypnotized. Too often, people fall within in these basically illusions of what hypnotism really is. Again, the example Bunchy gave when you talk about someone singing a song that they do not like, no, they don't like it, but find themselves singing it, is a classic example of brainwashing and programming, and as well as going into hypnotism. So when you think about that as it applies to a specific song, now think about the fact going into television programming in terms of the type of shows that people watch. It is hypnotizing and causing you to change your perception and control your perception to the degree of rendering you basically impotent in terms of being able to have a awareness of mass mobilization and mass movement. It also tends to nullify a lot of the spirit that most of us would have in terms of recognizing that something must be done now. Because what happens when typically especially when you talk about the horror movies and action movies, is that it takes certain chemicals within you and you express and feel through the movie these specific actions. And by doing that on a day-to-day basis, what it ends up doing is end up taking your actual will and the fight out of you, because it is diffused through the fact that you're able to watch or project or see yourself in a movie that's doing some of the same things. And so therefore it becomes a source of entertainment, and it becomes a way to neutralize you ever acting upon an effort to raise yourself to the level of the actions that are portrayed in these movies. And it even goes into the fact that when you talk about certain types of movies, for instance, even when we talk about stuff like movies that even portray some of the things we would like to see, it diffuses the population, or it diffuses the actions, because you saw it on the screen sometimes. And so one of the things that we didn't necessarily talk about here within Black August, when you get into the ways to acknowledge Black August, it talks about actually fasting from television and radio. Those are one of the things that you are supposed to do within the month of Black August, so that you can help deprogram the mind and get back to the concept of being able to recognize what we call self thoughts and concepts, because so much of the actions that people take are based upon something of some form of influence that has been interjected into them, and they think that they thought about this on their own, or they think that they wanted to do this act on their own, but more likely than not, it's based upon some commercial or some exposure to something that over time caused you to basically move in that direction. And then I'm gonna say one other thing as an example of that, and then we're gonna move on. And I like to use this example simply because it's real catchy. When you hear the commercial, Nationwide is on your side. That cliche causes you to connect the concept of something being on your side with an insurance company called Nationwide. And by having that slogan written within a catchy tune, it bypasses your direct consciousness and go into your subconsciousness. And so what happens is you associate something as warm and secured bound as being on your side with an insurance company. Next thing you know, a person may sit up and decide that, you know what, I want to try out this insurance company, not realizing that they basically just fell for a form of programming that sat and seeped within their mind at a certain time. And through that mantra of constantly being interjected with that, it becomes a part of your perception, and it becomes a part of your reality in terms of how you think. And that just comprise that, along with all of the television programming that's going on, all of the commercials that you see, whether it be through visual or auditory, and recognize that these are aspects of programming, and they all create situations to divide the people from a collective awareness. Doc, I'll let you go ahead and speak, Doc.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I know you said we wanted to move on, but I just wanted to really quickly, and this is a weird one and kind of uncomfortable, but when we recognize, programming people to commit violence, and we see all these, acts of right-wing violence, particularly committed by these ultra-right-wing, incels, which is who a lot of these mass shooters and people like that are. Yeah. We also need to recognize, the hypnotic effect of, violent pornography being readily available.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a big one. That's a big one, taboo, that most people definitely don't want to talk about. But all of this again leads right into the different things that are used again against the mass population. And the whole point of this discussion, in essence, is for us to be aware of the different aspects of weaponization and how they're being used against us, so that when we organize as a collective and we find ourselves stumbling in terms of just being able to synchronize, a lot of this has to do with the baggage that we personally carry, that we interject and bring to the group. So the more we're aware of how we're constantly at war with ourselves, then the better prepared we'll be able to be in terms of dissecting these things down. Now that brings us to talking a little bit about the Patriot Act. And the reason why we're talking about this is just to kind of show the framework in which a lot of things were modernized and brought up to speed to go into some of the current programs that's being used. So within the Patriot Act, Title Number 1, it enhanced domestic security against terrorism. What's important about this one here is the act authorized measures to enhance the ability of domestic security service to prevent terrorism. This entitled established a fund for counter-terrorist activities, includes funding for terrorist screening centers, which is administered by the FBI. So it basically opened up more additional governmental funding, and it closed certain gaps that prevented them from being able to operate on more of a domestic territory, which is key to this, because when we go back and we talk about some of the operations, specifically when we was up early on, we was talking about the war on drugs and how the role the CIA played in flooding the communities with drugs, we start getting into domestic operations. So these domestic operations are not supposed to be happening on American soil. These tactics that are being used, that is known to be used by the CIA on foreign territories, are being deployed here in the United States. And most of us think that these activities, in essence, are illegal activities, because at one point in time it was, but based upon certain laws, and especially when you talk about privatizing certain types of operations, which is why, like for instance, when we dealt with MK Ultra and a lot of the privatizing of different experiments that go on, these are the loopholes in which how the government entities are able to get away from a quote unquote tying themselves to these specific acts by creating a certain level of privatization, and then able to, from that standpoint, close down and shut down the program, and it appears as though it has stopped. So Title Number 2, enhanced surveillance procedures. By enhancing surveillance procedures, it covers all aspects of surveillance and suspected terrorists, those suspected of engaging in computer fraud or abuse, and agents of foreign power who are engaged in clandestine activities. It allowed the government agencies to gather foreign intelligence information from both U.S. and non-U.S. citizens. And that's what's key there, because again, that opened up the door to be able to quote unquote do these type of acts. The title allowed removal. Again, here you go, the key here. It allowed the removal of legal wall between criminal investigation and surveillance for the purpose of gathering foreign intelligence, which hampered investigations when criminal and foreign surveillance overlapped. So a lot of the things here that can consider to be criminal can now be reclassified and authorized to fall under terrorism. And that's key here, because a lot of the things that we deal with that are set up now are based upon these loopholes in these tightened down of these titles here. The scope and availability of wiretapping and surveillance orders were expanded under Title II. Wiretaps expanded to include addressing and routing information to allow surveillance of packet switch networks. That is real powerful right there in itself. That one is very powerful, people, for those that are familiar with information technology. In other words, the cyber pathways included at the network level, so that the ability to obtain encrypted or secure data can be captured between the source and destination. Now, let me explain something real quick about the importance of that. Oftentimes, for instance, people tend to think that, well, when someone hacks into a specific site or steal the information that way, that that is how a lot of this information is accessed. People tend to think at a destination or a source is when hacking takes place. But now what we're talking about here is switch networks. So basically, without going into it, you know, and again, y'all can research more of this on your own. Information has to travel. As information travels, when you hit enter on your keyboard and you click on something, you're basically routing through switches and through switches and routers to get to the destination. If I grab that information at any point between that, now I have the ability to do so in a legal capacity. So therefore, I did not have to hack the site. I did not have to hack your computer. I intercepted the transmission. And by intercepting the transmission, it basically gave me, removed, like they said, this legal wall to where now that information can be obtained and used against you in the court of law. So therefore, it's not about getting the information directly from the end user or directly from the provider at that point. They can retrieve the information in its route. So that's very important and powerful in terms of how something that can be disguised as criminal now be considered a terrorist classification. Title number 3, anti-money laundering to prevent terrorism. The International Money Laundering Abatement and Financial Anti-Terrorism Act of 2001 intended to facilitate the prevention, detection, and prosecution of international money laundering and financing of terrorism. This provides more legal means to seize assets and of suspected terrorists to be used for funding law enforcement initiatives. And that's really the key to that, is that it just basically allows governmental entities to find ways to seize money, and then, you know, use it as a field necessary. Border security, title number 4, basically amends the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 to give more law enforcement and investigative powers to the U.S. Attorney General and to the Immigration Neutralization Services. Oops. Hold on just a second. I lost my feed. Hold on. Are y'all still there?
Yes, sir.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Hold on. Let me go back to that. I lost my screen share for a second. Okay, there we go. Can y'all see that?
Yes, sir.
All right. Okay, number 5, removing of obstacles to investigating terrorism. Title number 5 allowed the U.S. Attorney General to pay rewards to pursue of advertisements for assistance of Department of Justice to combat terrorism and prevent terrorist acts. This ties into more resources to recruit informants. Going back to what we talked about within the COINTELPRO aspect of it, basically what you're getting at now is there's more means of operation in terms of financial gains that can be utilized to recruit informants and recruit provocateurs or recruit people into programs that lead toward what they refer to as fighting terrorism. So that's what's important about that. Now, title number 6, victims of families and families of victims of terrorism. This basically allowed the Victims Crime Act of 1984 to change how the U.S. Victims of Crime Fund was managed and funded, improving a speedy provision of the aid of families of public safety officers by expediting payments to officers and families of officers killed or injured in the line of duty, which just basically creates incentives for them to go out and be enforcers to a lot of the stuff that's against the people. Number 7 here, increase information sharing for critical infrastructure protection. The purpose of this title is to increase the ability of the U.S. law enforcement to counter terrorist activity that cross jurisdictional boundaries. And by doing that, now all of a sudden, they're not out of their jurisdiction anymore. And because of a specific type of act of something being classified as terrorism, they're able to supersede those boundaries. And so that's what's important to recognize about that. Now, number 8, terrorism criminal law alters the definition of terrorism and establish or redefines rules which deal with it. And that's the kicker there. It redefines the term domestic terrorism to broadly include mass destruction as well as as assassination or kidnapping as a terrorist activity. So the thing about it is, again, it just opens up aspects of recognizing how a criminal act can now be reclassified as terrorism. The definition also encompasses activities that are dangerous to human life that are a violation of the criminal laws of the United States or of any state and are intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, influence the policy of the government by intimidating or coercion, or taken into effect to conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping while in the jurisdiction of the United States. So terrorism is also included in this definition of racketeering, which allowed the tie into the RICO laws. And that's why I wanted to emphasize that, because again, based upon certain types of activities, now you have a process, and based upon the Patriot Act, now you have a process which allows them to tie in multiple resources to come at a person or an organization from different angles, and then get additional funding to do so. Title number 9, improved intelligence. This amends the National Security Act of 1947 to require the Director of Central Intelligence to establish requirements and priorities for foreign intelligence collecting under the FICA, and to provide assistance to the United States Attorney General to ensure that information derived from electronic surveillance or physical searches is disseminated for efficient and effective foreign intelligence purposes. So again, it just gives them the opportunity and the right backing to be able to disperse that through international means. One of the things that's important for us to recognize that is, especially when you start talking about cyber technology and warfare and weaponization used against the people, if I sit my server, if my server is residing in another country, then in essence is outside of the jurisdiction of the United States. So me sitting certain types of documents, you know, that may be viewed upon as being, you know, terroristic in nature, they can reside on something that's outside of the law or outside of the you know, actual physical location of a country that would prohibit that information. But going back to what we talked about with MK Ultra and mind programming, and now we talk about when we deal with the electronic surveillance and being able to cross over into international aspects, now they have the power to reclassify and redirect resources to still be able to come after those that are, you know, think that they're hiding this information or rerouting that information in different places, and they be outside of the jurisdiction. And so title number 10, miscellaneous, created or altered a number of miscellaneous laws that did not fit into any other section of the United States Patriot Act. The hazmat license were limited to drivers who passed background checks and who could demonstrate that they could handle the materials. Now, what that also goes into is when you talk about what happened with Timothy McVeigh in terms of getting a hold of ammonium nitrate in large quantities, as well as the transportation of transporting of that. So things like that prevented, basically now you require hazmat licenses just to obtain and deal with the delivery of materials. And so that locked down and made it a lot more difficult for certain types of actions like that to even begin to take place, as well as not something that we discussed in this document here, but they went as far as, especially as it applies to ammonium nitrate, start ingraining what they call micro fingerprints within the powders themselves, to where they can go back and track the source of that of the processing of that material. So that's something that a lot of people are not aware of. That is one of the tools that are used in terms of tracking and finding out who did what. And this basically section ends kind of within what we talked about in some of my previous discussions, back identity extremism, which basically created a situation to where the FBI still based upon all of the things that was going on through Trump, through the rise of white nationals, still to where they focused and honed in on Black identity as being an extreme situation. So therefore, by going into and studying your Black identity or want to reconnect yourself with your culture, that made you an extremist. By being classified as an extremist, it basically allows you to be classified as a terrorist. Once you're classified as a terrorist, now all of a sudden there's certain parameters that can open up that can be used against you, which allow them to use some of the same tactics that were used, quote unquote, illegally back in the 60s and 70s against us now. But based upon what we talked about, especially as it applies to programming, now one of the things that is not commonly looked at when we talk about programming is that don't always consider that to be a concept that goes into basically making you do be explosive. Programming also is used to make you docile, and that's the one thing that I really want us to recognize in terms of certain aspects of programming, is that it actually a lot of the programming that's being done is actually neutering and watering down the population, the masses of the people. And by doing so, we don't tend to want to engage in the type of work that we're the Panther Party and the Black Panther Party is involved in. We don't find ourselves being able to recruit because people are so caught up in basically just comforts, caught up in not caring or giving a damn, caught up in not wanting to know what it means to be politicized. In any and every excuse they can come up with, they have. And so from that standpoint, recognize that one of the great aspects of what happens with programming is just making the population just neutralizing the population in terms of action. So now what we want to talk about, before I go any further, is there anybody got anything they want to add to what we talked about here before we close out this section, or questions? Go ahead, Brother Bunchy.
Okay, y'all can hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, cool. I was just gonna say, I say this to people all the time. I normally say it during orientation, and I've said it several times, just in talking to the comrades. We have to recognize all of these things that you're dropping right now are perfect proof of what I always say, and it's because we don't have some of the disadvantages that the Panthers had back in.
Right. No, we can't hear you, Bunchy. Are you still talking? Can anybody hear Bunchy?
Negative.
All right, jump back in whenever you can, brother. Just raise your hand. Right now, we can't hear you if you talk. Anybody else have anything to add? All right, let me move on. So now what we want to do is talk a little bit about some of the technology. And we're going to start with some of the technology that's actually old in terms of what's being deployed now, because most everything is dealt with through software now. But it's for the sake of exposing everyone to the technology that was used and how things are moving forward. So one of the things we want to get into is what we call the Stingray. And the Stingray is a IMSI catcher, which is basically International Mobile Subscriber Identity. Hold on a second. Okay. Yeah, let me make this statement again. For those that want this document, just shoot your email in the chat group, and I'll make sure it's made available to you. So IMSI catcher is a surveillance solution used by military and intelligence agency for telephone eavesdropping. It allows for intercepting mobile phone traffic and trafficking movements of mobile phone users. Essentially, the catcher operates as a bogus mobile cell tower that sits between the target's phone and the service provider's real tower. Stingray allows for law enforcement to intercept calls and internet traffic, send fake texts, interject malware on phone devices, and locate targets. Now, one thing I want to make known, going back to COINTELPRO, I don't know if y'all can see what I highlight. Send fake texts. I can't emphasize this anymore, any harder. One of the things that is constantly used nowadays in terms of a deployed weapon is actually sending fake text messages to various comrades based upon, you know, creating that type of drama, that type of static, or that type of animosity between people that don't really exist. And so we have to be careful about when you get text messages that just don't make sense or just seem out of the blue. I would always recommend, if you in doubt about something that someone is texting you, pick up the phone and call them. Pick up the phone and call them. Because what happens is, again, through this technology, they're able to interject stuff into your phone. And even to this day, all cell phones operate and pick up through cell towers. And the cell phone technology is designed to grab the nearest cell tower. There's even applications that are out there, though, that can help you identify what cell towers are actually basically trafficking your signals. And by that, sometimes you're able to determine if it's a legitimate cell tower or not. There's even some software that you can get that can pinpoint the cell towers that your phones are using. And by doing so, you'll be able to determine to some degree sometimes whether or not it's a device that is sitting in between a real cell tower or not. Now, what's important also about this, remember when we was talking about the Patriot Act, we talked about how information can be intercepted. And by it being intercepted, that means that it can legally be used against you. So they don't have to actually hack your phone directly. They can intercept the traffic within your phone. And from that standpoint, it's now can be legitimately used. Hold on real quick.
Oh yeah, I talked about that a lot in my class on counterintelligence and the danger of social media and how they manufacture relationships to the point where it seems like you're even like it's a coincidence that you're talking to somebody, or that, you know, even engagement from specific people come across your phone, but it's just not cut and dry like that. It's been proven that, you know, it's at the point now where, you know, relationships interpersonally are being manufactured, you know, towards a certain end. And that the goal isn't, you know, radical change up front, but, you know, to inch each of us closer and closer into a direction over time. You see that in the weaponization of memes, you know, but, you know, seem innocent, but it's just interesting how these factors drive how we move. And I think it's important to have education on, you know, how to counter that, as far as, you know, actually having a secure means of communication. You know, I seen a thing a while back about how to, you know, properly use phones or, you know, whatnot, you know, going to and from a protest if you actually want to be like, you know, all signals, so to speak. But it's definitely important to recognize how these things have been weaponized so that, you know, you stand a chance against it.
Right. And again, a lot of times this is classes, you know, as well for the general public as well as members, is that a lot of times we just are not aware of what's going on. We're not aware of the technology, what the technology we're using can actually do and how it can be used against you. So it's just important that we're aware of this. And so this is not to scare anybody, and it's not meant to draw you into conspiracy type mentality. It's just to know, look, this is really what's going on. This is what's really happening. The next item here to discuss in regards to the technology here is the Gossamer. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but the Gossamer is a small portable device that can be used to secretly gather data on mobile phones operating in a target area. It sends out a covert signal that tricks the phones into handing over their unique codes, such as the IMSI and the TMSI, which can then be used to identify users and homes in specific devices of interest. What makes this different from the Stingray, not only is this device much smaller, but it can also be used to perform denial of service attacks on phone users, blocking targeted people from making or receiving calls. The Gossamer has the appearance of a clunky looking handheld transceiver. One photograph filed by the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office shows displaying an option for mobile integration on its small LCD screen, which can sit above a telephone style keypad. So in other words, this one example here is just one of the models, but they have various different ones that, you know, obviously at this point in time, and again, this is older technology. So at this point in time, they got stuff like this that can probably operate through software on general technology that standard cell phone. One thing I do want to make reference to here is knowing that it can block targeted people from making or receiving calls. One of the things that this draws me to bring into light here is the attack upon the Uhuru movement that took place. I believe that was July the 29th, when they basically synchronized the attack against different offices. And when they did so, utilizing technology similar to this, what happened was they actually were able to not only jam the phones of those people that they were targeting, but based upon being able to draw in and have access to those phones, they were able to jam everybody within their phone list numbers so that anybody in your phone list also couldn't use their phones. So this is how powerful and how more advanced the technology then came to where your entire contact list can be jammed all at once. And so that's powerful. So it's important to recognize how this stuff is utilized. Next item here, Hailstorm. The Hailstorm is the latest funded under the Homeland Security UASI grant of 2012. So I wanted to bring that up real quick. It was funded under the Homeland Security in the line of mobile phone tracking tools that the Harris Corp, which I would advise y'all look that up information, but you're not able to find much on them in terms of the public site, but just know that this specific organization does blackout programs for the government. Is offered to authorities. However, a few details about it have trickled into the public domain. It can be purchased as a standalone unit or as an upgrade to the Stingray or the Kingfish, which suggests that it has the same functionality as these devices, but can be tweaked with new or more advanced capabilities. Procurement documents show that the Harris Corp has at least one case recommended that authorities use the Hailstorm in conjunction with software made by a Nebraska-based surveillance company called Penlink. The Penlink software enables authorities to deploying the Hailstorm to directly communicate with cell phone carriers over an internet connection, possibly to help coordinate the surveillance of targeted individuals. So now you can actually turn right around and use the internet for interception through phone signals. So that further enhanced and makes this is powerful technology.
Yeah, I always use Harris radios for military operations. So you're getting into really encrypted, like large level government contract, entities that tap into basically the defense fund.
Yeah.
So, you're talking about just straight up $1 trillion government funding at that point. We're talking about this right here.
Right.
They basically own the military as far as how they communicate.
Cool. Thanks for that information. So it's encouraged then for y'all to just look up and find more information about that you can about that corporation. And again, going right back to what we were saying earlier, we're talking about private organizations or private entities really controlling the bulk of what's being done and operated through government funding. So now we want to get into is software environment recognition systems, which is the next level up of the game. LPR recognition systems, which is license plate recognition systems. Camera systems that are able to make out and capture license plates. This technology has also been enhanced to identify full vehicles by taking the same approach applied to face and body recognition systems. This produces a vehicle digital signature or fingerprint, which can even identify the same vehicle with a different plate or no plate at all. These systems work in tangent with available government databases and can be used to track a targeted associated with a vehicle and alert the allocated agency of the presence of the vehicle. LPR back office systems can be deployed to work with most pre-existing CCTV systems and therefore take feeds from one source and reroute the feed to various departments using that applied software without the closed circuit television feed source being made aware of the additional surveillance usage. And so basically think of that as being able to hack into, so to speak, a camera. And by doing so, now the analytics or this software can utilize that feed for whatever purposes that they want to use to deal with this license plate recognition system. So that's super important in terms of the technology that's out there. That also moves us to human identification at a distance software, which is also called HID. HID systems are able to work with low resolution images of face and enhance using facial hallucination techniques. In CCTV imagery, faces are often very small, but because facial recognition algorithms that identify and plot facial features require high resolution images, resolution enhancement techniques have been developed to enable facial recognition systems to work with imagery that has been captured in environments with high signal to noise ratio, which basically means a lot of static in the environment, but it's still able to grab the proper information. So face hallucination algorithms are applied to images prior to those images being submitted to the facial recognition system, use example-based machine learning with pixel substitution. Face hallucination techniques are also used to pre-treat images where faces are disguised. Patterns can also be applied to further identify a target based upon thermal and body language. DeepMind information technology has made it possible to extract sound from still photo imaging, which can be applied to retrieve sound from targets not visible within view of the actual image. Let me stop right there to real quick tell you just how powerful that is. Basically what we're saying in DeepMind information, AI, I'm sorry, DeepMind AI is a type of basically coding or program that was able to, really enhance the ability of artificial intelligence. And so from that standpoint, what we're talking about now is you can take a picture, a still image picture, and extract sound from that picture. And that is real powerful when you talk about that, because most people probably never even heard of that being done. And so from this standpoint, we're talking about some real powerful technology. And so taking a still image and being able to triangulate certain images within that image, you can now retrieve sound from something that is not even in the image. Man, that is powerful. So database warehousing is being utilized to store vast amounts of information, taking whole environment captures to predict future interactions within a given field. As a result of the current state of AI, artificial intelligence, this is blossoming into a whole new field of science that is able to simulate what's referred to as next move presence. The applications of these sectors are classified and exposures relegated to science fiction, but the technology as it exists in experimental phases is real. So this is a real big one that I just wanted to make sure y'all are aware of in terms of what's going on. So now this brings us to some of the future aspects that we're going to be, now begin to close on. The future of nano weaponization. The European Commission sponsored the development of the Programmable Artificial Cell Evolution, which is called the PACE program, from 2004 to 2008. This is how far back that happened, whose goal was to lay the foundation for the creation of a microscopic, self-organizing, self-replicating, and evolvable autonomous entities built from a single organic or inorganic substance that can be genetically programmed to perform specific functions for the eventual integration into information systems. That's what's important about here. So basically, we're talking about cybernetics. And this was done in 2004. The PACE project developed the first Omega machine, a microfluidic life support system of artificial cells that could complement chemically missing functionalities. The ultimate aim was to attain an evolvable hybrid cell in a complex micro-scale programmable environment. The functions of the Omega machine could then be removed stepwise, posing a series of solvable evolution challenges to an artificial cell chemistry. The project achieved chemical integration and resolved programmable microfluid environments for the integration of containment and genetic amplification. The project led to the creation of the European Center for Living Technology. So I recommend y'all check that out. European Center for Living Technology. Now, this is the kicker here. Heavy investing in artificial biology has been done by large companies such as ExxonMobil. So now explain to me, what in the hell does ExxonMobil have to do with this? See, this is where you start seeing the big picture of what's going on. And then I want to end today's discussion on talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, which was which we just started dealing with. We just dealt with here. This would double the size of the RS to create 87,000 new agents to beef up enforcement. The Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 allocates 80 billion to increase enforcement by the IRS. As of 2 years ago, the IRS had an arsenal of 4,600 guns. We don't know what's going to go down now, but I brought all that up to go back to the fact that when we earlier started talking about COINTELPRO, we earlier started talking about weaponization against the masses of the people, that the IRS and through taxes was one of the main things that was opened up. And so now what we see happening now is something that was planned literally 20 or more years ago has came into fruition based upon what's about to take place now. And so it's about putting the patterns together and seeing how all this it is warping it into fruition and where it's heading. So the sooner we're able to recognize certain forms of weaponization that are being utilized, the better we can form a defense. And so with that, the last thing here is just a few of the references so that y'all can see where the sources come from, the information that I've been sharing. Any questions or closing comments anybody like to make? Go ahead, Doc.
Yeah, just to that point about the size of the IRS, this is kind of where like some of the things we've been discussing kind of work together against us, because when you talk about the way people are programmed and the way people are programmed not only to be explosive but to be docile, to be lazy, the IRS, the thing about the IRS is that when it comes to tax fraud, right, obviously so many very wealthy, powerful people engage in tax fraud, even just people who might not even be politically connected but are wealthy, and most wealthy people are politically connected. But regardless, but trying to nail them on that tax fraud because they have so much money and they're hiding it in so many different ways, that takes a lot of work. If you or I, cheat on our taxes or even make a mistake on our taxes, figuring out the amount to which we, might have underpaid, and going after us for that takes much, much less work. So if people are already programmed to be docile or to not want to be lazy, right? They can go after us, and that doesn't take nearly as much of their time. So these IRS agents, if they're wanting to make busts, they can easily go after the people, the little people who don't have a lot of money, and catch them that way with much, much less effort on their part. So even if they're not acting with malice, which many of them obviously are, they're already drawn towards going after the people just through their programming and that human tendency.
Yeah. And what's funny about this, and then I'm gonna let or2 speak, is that what's being projected and promoted to the public is that the hire of these new agents is specifically to go after the people that make over $400,000 or more. But we know that's BS. For you to think that you're literally doubling or more the size of the agency just to go after anybody above 400,000. And it's also promoted that they, by allocating the $80 billion, they're going to recover like over $120 billion as a result. Go to or2, you speak, and then Bunchy.
On the synergistic and insidious effects of big data and all this technology, recently in the news, I saw that Roomba, which has previously been straight out busted, selling maps of people's homes, their floor layouts as mapped out by the Roombas running around, selling that to the highest bidder. In turn, Amazon, already having a known reputation and having been busted for just giving the cops ring data, giving the cops access to user data and such, just for the asking because they said, oh, it might be an emergency. And then Amazon recently proposed that they are going to buy Roomba. So we've already got one company known for being data brokers being bought out by an even gianter company, also well known for being data brokers specifically to the cops. So just layers upon layers of warning signs that the information superstructure has been completely turned against us. What we call the internet now is not what I called the internet 20 years ago. It's all weaponized.
Yes, right. Thank you for that. Brother Bunchy.
No doubt. I was just going to finish what I was saying before. Like when I came back in, when I finally got back in, I was like, man, he on the roll. I'm gonna just shut up and let him do his thing. But like, it's still a relevant point, even after everything else that you got to the conclusion. A lot of the things that you're talking about and advances that have been made in technology have been made specifically for the exact same reason as what I said previously. We don't have the disadvantages. Like the thing is, people don't realize that the internet was available to the government prior to it ever being available to us. Like they were using the internet many years before we even knew it was a thing.
Right.
So they had to make those advances in order to stay a step ahead of organizing and utilizing the terrorist. When they put the terrorist jacket on you, it's very easy for them to utilize that title or that tag to drag you through the mud and attach you to other things that have nothing to do with your movement. So be very wary of the people that you communicate with, the people that you associate with, because a lot of the things that you've already shown from the things that identify people from a distance or identify license plates or even entire vehicles, all of these things are being used at every level, be it county, city, state, national, international. They're being used at every single level. So there's no particular branch or chapter or whatever that is exempt from these things being possible. And we live in Washington State, which is one of the technology capitals of the country. So we should definitely know that it's occurring here. We've already seen reports of what the cops in Minnesota were doing in regards to what was supposed to be secure communication between activists. So the advances in technology seem somewhat scary to some people, but they had to do those things because the type of things that they did in the 60s and the 70s to derail movements would no longer be effective in this era with the advantages that we have just as regular citizens. So,
and with that, everyone always keep in mind that military technology is at least 20 years ahead of what's commercially made available to the general public. So when we talk about the things that I was just going over in terms of the program that was happening between 2004 and 2008, dealing with the programmable artificial cell evolution, again, that was 2004. And I can pretty much guarantee most of y'all had no idea of that taking place back then. But yet, here we go, private organization was doing it. Go ahead, Luna Star.
Okay, this is off topic, but it's I have a question for you. I know obviously you study Comedicism, but do you also teach it?
No, unfortunately, I do not. And let me say this. The reason why I don't necessarily myself get into teaching that is because really more or less a time factor, and my role is giving people exposure to certain things that overall will help us go where we need to go. But I do have some additional resources. I myself, in terms of that, just to give you a little bit of background on me, I used to, if those of y'all that are more old school may be familiar with a brother by the name, a griot by the name of Artichoke, who lives in Dallas, Texas. I used to study some under him when I lived in Dallas, Texas. And I came into a wealth of information from that standpoint, and it opened my eyes in reference to really just how religion has been weaponized against the people. And that's a whole nother discussion in itself. And so in order to not basically crush people's religious perspective, oftentimes I don't get into that, but I will drop jewels and let people come to their own realization from that standpoint as they move forward within the movement. But I do appreciate you asking me about that. But I can if you leave your email, I can definitely build with you, a little bit more on that, just in conversation.
Okay, I definitely love that. Thank you.
All right. Anybody else before we close out? All right. Well, I definitely appreciate everybody for building with us tonight. And I do want to leave you with that one thing on a positive and a high note and a progressive note: synchronized direct action consciousness, and for us to work and focus toward encounter intelligence programming for the people. So this is our goal as organizers and revolutionaries. That being said, all power to the people.